So if we're looking at, those traditional feed ingredients, are there other opportunities to use potential alternative ingredients? And one of those that comes up was that corn-fermented protein. And so from the dry mill ethanol production system, we've got a lot of products that come off of there. And so we're, often familiar with 𝗺𝗘𝗃𝗃 or dried distillers grains with solubles, but that isn't necessarily a feedstuff for young pigs. Comes into the diet later. So what can we do with other products that come off the ethanol production system? And corn-fermented protein is one that comes off as a good one with good digestibility and nutrient availability to look at for nursery pigs.
Welcome to the Swine Nutrition Blackbelt Podcast, the latest swine nutrition research digested for you. I'm your host, 𝗬𝗃𝗃, and today we have with us Dr. Ryan Samuel, an assistant professor and extension swine specialist at South Dakota State University. So Ryan, it's been a little while since you've been on the show, so before we begin, could you tell the audience a little bit about your background?
Very good. Well, happy to be here. So I am originally from Alberta, Canada, and did my master's and PhD up there in Edmonton at the University of Alberta. And so in that studies, I was looking at sow amino acid metabolism and energy metabolism. And then since been coming here to and joining SDSU, been working on the wean to finish production area. And so looking at the impacts of that in our commercial research production facility. And so just investigating different things of management, nutrition, and along with that we've been doing at that particular facility. So,
gotcha. So soy protein concentrate is a fairly popular ingredient when feeding nursery pigs. And I see that you guys have been doing some work regarding a novel corn fermented protein that could be used as a substitute. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and what all you guys have looked into?
True, yeah. So if we're looking at, those traditional feed ingredients, are there other opportunities to use potential alternative ingredients? And one of those that comes up was that corn-fermented protein. And so from the dry mill ethanol production system, we've got a lot of products that come off of there. And so we're, often familiar with 𝗺𝗘𝗃𝗃 or dried distillers grains with solubles, but that isn't necessarily a feedstuff for young pigs. Comes into the diet later. So what can we do with other products that come off the ethanol production system? And corn-fermented protein is one that comes off as a good one with good digestibility and nutrient availability to look at for nursery pigs.
Gotcha. So with this corn-fermented protein, do you typically just substitute that in at the same rate that you would use soy protein concentrate, or have you in just for the N1? Or would you also kind of look into using it for the N2 and N3 phases as well?
So this is the point of the kind of the research study that we did and kind of get into that question. You're right. So we looked at the direct replacement from 0 to 12% and those graded levels in between there. So we had 0, 4, 8, and 12%. And we're looking at that direct replacement of soy protein concentrate and trying to ascertain or discover if we could just directly replace it and how it would actually fit in the diet. And then looking at the next diet, the second phase, we cut those in half, knowing that the levels of amino acids and nutrients we were going to get from it were going to potentially overload some of those nursery pig systems. And because one of those that comes into the situation is when you've got corn on corn, you've got leucine driving and changing the performance of the animals. And so we wanted to make sure we weren't overloading the system with too much corn, too much leucine, and trying to maintain that amino acid balance.
Gotcha. So when maintaining that amino acid balance, I know it's been a little while, but I had some studies on here in the past that talked about that branch chain amino acid ratio and how that can impact the performance of the animals. So did you guys have to add any branch chain amino acids to try to balance that out at all?
That is kind of the topic of some subsequent studies that we want to look at. And so that was exactly the question that we were kind of come around to, of the fact that whether we can actually balance those branch chain amino acids and what would be the amino acids we need to bring in to accomplish that.
Gotcha. So when looking at the overall performance of the pigs through this study, what all did you guys look at and how did that product end up working out?
Sure. So we did this at the South Dakota State University Commercial Research Facility. So that facility holds 1,200 head of weaned pigs, and again, it's a wean to finish facility. So we brought in those pigs, and then we had those 4 different treatments that we fed. Again, and from 0, 4, 8, 12% inclusion of either soy protein concentrate, or when we switched that over to the corn-fermented protein, and then balance those diets in phase 1. Phase 2, we had the inclusion of 0, 2, 4, and 6%. So again, just so we didn't overload the system potentially on leucine provided there. So, and then the common diet in that 3rd phase to see what the effect of that was. It's kind of, you kind of bring in, as we normally do in nursery pigs, bring in the expensive, important ingredients to begin with, and then kind of phase those out as those pigs get on feed and start to do better, coming from transitioning from sow's milk to solid feed. So we fed those 44 pens, and we have the feed logic system in that barn, and so we're able to deliver the specific diets to those specific pens, randomized throughout the barn. Had about 26 head per each of our pens, and so that and 2 waterers and then a feeder in there, so they had good, representative commercial conditions that we fed them in there. So just looked over the nursery period, and so we fed about 8 pounds in the first phase. It was 12 in the next phase, and then they finished up that nursery phase, about 35 or so pounds of feed to finish that up. So that was kind of the goal of it, and looking at those 4 comparison treatments to see what effects there were on average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and then feed efficiency. So if we looked in terms of average daily gain and average daily feed intake, we didn't see any big things that jumped out, with the exception being that when we got up to the 12% or the full replacement of soy protein concentrate with corn-fermented protein, we started to see some performance differences, and that was mostly mostly seeing a feed intake difference at that 12% or that full replacement of soy protein concentrate with the corn-fermented protein. We start to think about that on a larger scale, and we've seen that effect coming from branched chain amino acid imbalances. And so if we think about those and think about leucine specifically, we start to see the impact of that on the feed intake and therefore the performance of those animals. So we saw those early on, that 12%, that little depression, but then when they went on to the common diet in that 3rd phase, then that seemed to allow those pigs to catch up, and that kind of washed out the effect. But that's, again, something we want to look at more so and see what we can look at for what the effects are, and those, if that was the effect, if it's a branched chain amino acid effect, or if there's some other effect, that why going to that 12% actually impacted those pigs negatively on performance measurements.
𝗿𝗫𝗃 is moving beyond feed additives to create foundational ingredients that work with your pig's physiology to support resilience and health. With proven technologies like ambatine, flow matrix, and endura, 𝗿𝗫𝗃 helps you address the toughest challenges in swine production. From gut health to growth performance, together we can make animals more resilient in the face of future challenges. Learn how at 𝗿𝗫𝗃impact.com.
Awesome. And you've already mentioned it a few times about kind of the next steps in the study, because you brought it up with looking at the different branched chain amino acid levels. But is that the only thing you're going to look at for this next study, or were there some other options you guys are going to look into?
Sure. So that seems to be the one that sticks in the front of my mind. And so the most obvious one I'm going to chase after would be the branched chain amino acid work. So where we've done work in finished pigs and looking at the effect of that. And so David Kleiser was a PhD student here, did a lot of work in that area. And so that really fits the potential story of what we think it is, and whether we can just adjust the inclusions of just those amino acids, branched chain amino acids, and how we would need to do that. And so that would be, and then there's other possibilities that exist, that why that cause might be going up that high. And so we may look at some of those again in the future if it doesn't pan out to be my first thought.
Gotcha. And then last question. So with this being a fermented product, are there any concerns with storage or stability throughout different seasons of the year?
Sure. So the first start off there, the fermentation process is really important, and that's what improves the digestibility and improves the energy digestibility and the nutrient availability from the product. And so that's really how the product is, and that's kind of why it's named that corn fermented protein. And so the question of whether there's a stability issue, we didn't and haven't been told or discovered that there's any stability issues with that, because once it's dried off out of the product stream and it comes as a dry product. And so then with that being dry and being kept dry, then you wouldn't have those issues. But so I wouldn't say that you'd have any more issues than if the feedstuffs get moisture, then you have issues regardless of their original source. So it does come with and contains some yeast in there. So there's a potential activation if you did get moisture in there. But again, it wouldn't necessarily be, in my mind, different than any other product.
Well, I believe that's all the time we have. So thank you, Ryan, for coming on the show and sharing all your research with us.
Very good. Yeah, thanks for the time. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yep, and everyone else, thank you for listening to the Swine Nutrition Blackbelt Podcast. Please visit us at swinenutritionblackbelt.com, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channel so you won't miss out on the next episode. See you next week.